everyone. Long time no see. How have you been?
Good.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you for sparing your precious time to join us. I'm Min-sun Lee, a volunteer for the GIC talk team. Before the talk begins, please either turn off your cell phones or switch them to silent mode. Do you guys know much information about pyramid? Today's speaker, whose talk is expected to last about 45 minutes, will tell us about mysteries of the Great Pyramid. Our speaker is Aaron M. Coyle. He came from the United States and he is a history teacher at Gwangju Foreign School. Drawing from years of research, critical thought, and continued revision, he believes that mysteries of the Great Pyramid offers persuasive evidence and perhaps even proof that the Great Pyramid was not a tomb. Do you guys ever wonder about it? Shall we discover his lecture, Mysteries of the Great Pyramid? Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our speaker with a big round of applause.
Can we get the first man? Yeah, can we get the lights on? I'll just give you a little warning right now. This is going to be a longer talk than usual, so please bear with me. It might even be in the neighborhood of an hour, so please bear with me. Okay. Man fears time, but time fears the pyramids. That is an Arab proverb. There are certain things I'll be skipping over as well for the sake of time, including this. It's sort of an informational thing. That, by the way, is an actual photograph of the three Giza pyramids taken when there was a sandstorm on the way. You can see there's a plane in the sky there. I have an amazing photograph. The Great Pyramid of Giza is still the most massive building in the world. The only other building that comes close is the one that is sitting right next to it, and that is the Pyramid of Khafre, sometimes called the Second Pyramid. Very distinctive in having some of its casing stones still remaining near the top of the pyramid. The Great Pyramid is also the most precise building ever constructed. This is something that may be surprising to a lot of people. We'll go into some detail as to why that's the case. How many Empire State Buildings could be constructed with the masonry of the Great Pyramid? We're talking just the blocks of stone, all the masonry in the Great Pyramid. How many? Any guesses? You can just throw them out there.
10.
Any guesses?
20.
Okay.
30.
Who's counting these? 30. 30, yeah. And that's just simple mathematics. The Great Pyramid was the tallest building in the world for more than 4,000 years until what structure was built taller? Anyone? The Eiffel Tower. It's the first building to be taller than the Great Pyramid. It's not a coincidence that the Eiffel Tower looks like a metal pyramid. The French have been fascinated with Egypt ever since Napoleon's invasion in 1798. That's Napoleon admiring the Sphinx. The Great Pyramid is still the most precisely constructed building in the world. The casing stones are one example. The pyramid originally contained about 100,000 casing stones, each weighing from 16 to 20 tons. And of course, as we see here, the casing stones originally gave all four sides of the pyramid an almost perfectly smooth surface. The casing stones of the Great Pyramid were manufactured with a tolerance of 1/100th inch and placed together with a tolerance of 1/50th inch, which is the thickness of a fingernail, Without getting too technical, that is nothing less than machine-age precision, according to Petrie. He said it was like optical precision on the scale of acres. These are the sorts of tools we would use today to cut things with the kind of tolerances we're talking about that I just mentioned. According to Christopher Dunn, author of the Giza power plant, there's a great difference between knowing what 1/100th inch is from an abstract academic viewpoint and understanding what 1/100th inch is from a hands-on practical experience. In short, Egyptologists don't understand what it takes to manufacture stone blocks to 1/100th inch. The accuracy of the measurements and tolerances achieved in the construction of the Great Pyramid are not required in modern buildings. In case any of you were thinking, well, wait a minute, it's the most precise building in the world, we have those modern skyscrapers. Modern skyscrapers aren't required to be so precise, and why do you think that might be? Maybe anyone? Because it's too expensive. It's too expensive to build buildings with that kind of precision. It's not necessary to make a sound and good building. Too expensive to do it, so they don't do that. Why in the world would it need to be done for the Great Pyramid? If the Great Pyramid is simply intended to be the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu, then why would it need to be so astoundingly precise? It wouldn't. How did they possess technology to achieve such precision? The casing stones again. In 1940, P. Groves, a British Air Force pilot, noticed something extraordinary when he was flying over the Great Pyramid. Maybe you can notice it. That's the Great Pyramid, that's the Pyramid of Khafre. In a now famous photograph, the Great Pyramid was shown to have 8 sides rather than 4. This subtle feature is best seen from the air on the spring and fall equinoxes. Indeed, the purpose of this feature may have been to signal the spring and fall equinoxes. Again, it's such a subtle feature that when you look at the pyramid with the naked eye, it looks, of course, like a 4-sided pyramid. You cannot notice that it has 8 sides. Only at a special time during the equinoxes. The engineering sophistication and precision required to make an 8-sided pyramid is astounding and almost beyond belief for that time. No other Egyptian pyramid has 8 sides. That's another look at the 8-sided nature of the Great Pyramid. Sad story, after an earthquake in the 14th century, many of the casing stones of the Great Pyramid were shaken loose. They were then stripped from the pyramid as well as from the Pyramid of Khafre and used to build mosques and other buildings in Cairo. Cairo was completely leveled. The only damage done to the pyramids was just shaking the casing stones just a little bit loose, enough to pry your tools in there and to extract them. The pyramids of Giza had become a stone quarry, and the defacing of those monuments would continue for several hundred years. The Mosque of Sultan Hassan in Cairo was built almost entirely with casing stones from the Great Pyramid. Other examples of precision include the laying of the foundation and the pyramid's orientation to the cardinal directions. Concerning the 13-acre foundation, Dr. Robert Schock, author of Pyramid Quest, says, "The Great Pyramid comes about as close to a perfect square as human engineering, modern or ancient, can make it." It's the book I was talking about. The orientation of the pyramid is almost exactly true north, as opposed to magnetic north, which is what a compass will indicate. Again, Schock says the Great Pyramid's orientation to the cardinal directions is about as perfect as human engineering can achieve. Did the Egyptians know the value of pi? It is often thought that the Greeks came up with the value of pi and that the ancient Egyptians would have had no idea about that. But according to this equation, it seems that pi is included within the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. That equation gives the run relative to the rise of the Great Pyramid. To build a pyramid that demonstrated pi for every rise of 14 units, there needed to be a horizontal run of 11 units. For every rise of 4, the pyramid had to show a run of pi. In other words, if pi were built into the Great Pyramid, the slope would need to be 51.854 degrees. Without the original casing stones, we'll never know the exact slope of the pyramid, but it is very close to 52 degrees. Petrie calculated that it was 51.866 degrees. You can answer that for yourself. Was that strictly a coincidence, or was pi built into the monument? Most historians say pi was first calculated correctly in the 3rd century BCE by the Greek mathematician Archimedes. It would appear, however, that Egyptians were aware of pi more than 2,000 years before Archimedes. Archimedes himself said that he got his knowledge of this from the Egyptians, but for some reason historians want to ignore that. What was the purpose of the Great Pyramid? Modern Egyptologists and every history textbook on the planet say the Great Pyramid was constructed simply to be the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu. Is it possible that they are wrong? That is the only statue we have of Khufu, and it is a few inches high. That's it for this supposedly amazing builder of the Great Pyramid. Let's consider 2 simple facts. No royal mummy has ever been found in an Egyptian pyramid, and of course that includes the Great Pyramid. This is one of the biggest misconceptions out there. Many people think there's all kinds of mummies that were discovered in pyramids. Not one. There is no writing anywhere inside or outside the Great Pyramid, with one odd exception in a place that was never intended to be seen. More on that later, if we have time for it. If you had built something as magnificent as the Great Pyramid, wouldn't you want future generations to know how and why you did it? Wouldn't you want them to know that you were a great king or queen, able to build such a monument? Why is there nothing in that monument telling us about it? That's the so-called King's Chamber. You can see how bare it is. Not one word, not one pictograph, nothing. These are tombs that we know are tombs, Egyptian tombs that are verified as definitely tombs. You can't find an inch where there isn't writing, pictographs, all kinds of images, the ceiling. Every single space is taken. Another tomb, it's the same thing, writing everywhere. There's another tomb. Another tomb. Another tomb. All kinds of hieroglyphs. That's what you'd expect. But not in the Great Pyramid, not in the King's Chamber, not one word. One might think that the mummies were stolen from the pyramids, but there are 3 reasons why that probably would not happen. One, the ancient Egyptians were very superstitious. They believed that a person would be cursed by touching or stealing a mummy, but I don't think that's the most valid reason. Number 2, this is probably it. It had no monetary value. A mummy could not be sold. There would be no reason to disturb a mummy. There were times when a priest might deface a mummy, but they wouldn't take it. They would leave it lying there in its tomb. And 3, stealing or defacing a royal mummy was punishable by death. And that is why more than 40 royal mummies have been found in the Valley of the Kings near Luxor. This, of course, is a place where there are many, many underground tombs, the Valley of the Kings. And you can see what I'm talking about right here. The Valley of the Kings. All the tombs were robbed except Tutankhamun's, famously. Tutankhamun's is the only tomb not robbed. But the royal mummies were not taken. Why? No one wanted to risk being cursed or executed by taking something that had no value. If, in fact, pyramids were tombs, there would have been some mummies discovered, surely, but never were. We are told that the 3 pyramids of Giza were built separately as the tombs of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. In 1982, a man named Robert Bravall looked at an aerial photograph of the Giza pyramids and noticed something peculiar. Okay? You can see there the Great Pyramid at the bottom. The second pyramid makes an almost perfect diagonal axis across, but then we see that the third smaller pyramid is offset from the axis there. Why is that? In 1983, he was camping in the Saudi Arabian desert, looked up at a perfectly clear night sky and saw this. These are the belt stars of Orion. Okay. The three Giza pyramids and belt stars of Orion are aligned almost perfectly. The correlation of sky to ground was most precise in the year 10,500 BCE for some unknown reason. If the correlation is correct, the implications are astounding. Nothing less than a master plan for the entire Giza Plateau. Orion happens to be the most important constellation to the ancient Egyptians, the symbol of the god Osiris. So there's no coincidence about those stars and those pyramids on the ground. This theory is now accepted even by Egyptologists. It's hard not to accept it. We are told by Egyptologists that each pyramid was constructed separately by pharaohs who were simply constructing their own tombs. A master plan linking sky and ground seems to infer a greater purpose for those monuments. But what? Who could have conceived of such a plan and seen it through to completion over several generations? And that is the book we're talking about, the theory linking the stars with the pyramids on the ground, the Orion mystery. Due to a lack of any physical evidence to support their theory, that the Great Pyramid was a tomb, Egyptologists would like us to believe that robbers took everything and left it completely empty. Their nice, neat little tomb robber theory. FYI, the tomb theory is mainly supported by the testimony of one person, Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited the Great Pyramid when it was already more than 2,000 years old. How can we be sure that the information he was getting from the Egyptian priests was accurate? So in other words, it was already a very ancient monument when Herodotus visited it. But this is mainly what you'll find still in the history books today, or what he claimed about the pyramid. We will now examine specific reasons why the tomb robber theory is almost certainly not true. To do that, we'll have to travel back to the 9th century CE. In the 9th century, a caliph of Baghdad named Al-Mamun was informed that the Great Pyramid contained a secret chamber with vast treasure and advanced technology. Al-Mamun was the son of Harun al-Rashid, the famous caliph of Baghdad, whose feats would be celebrated in Arabian Nights. In 820 CE, he took numerous engineers, architects, builders, and stonemasons to Egypt to find a way into the Great Pyramid. But knowledge of the location of the entrance had been lost. All four sides of the pyramid were covered with polished casing stones, including a special hinged casing stone that served as the entrance, something like this. Okay. Problem was the knowledge of that special entrance had been lost, so essentially Al-Mamun had no idea how to get in the pyramid. We'll skip over this if you don't mind. Okay, that's the area we'll be focusing on inside the pyramid. Now, if you were Al-Mamun and you didn't know where the entrance was, what might you do? Try to force your way in? You might do that. He basically forced his way in. He didn't have explosives, that hadn't been invented yet, but he had a special way of sort of cracking stones, and you put, like vinegar on it, and cold vinegar, and etc. And you can tunnel your way in, and that's exactly what he did. So he tunneled his way in about 100 feet or so, and he couldn't find the descending passage. Wait a second. This is Al-Mamun's entrance as we see it today. That's the original entrance. Something very fortunate happened. When his workers were tunneling inside, they heard something fall. Something might have been dislodged in here, and something fell, and they heard it. And they heard that it was off to the left. So they started tunneling off to the left. Okay, and then, remarkably, they were able to join with the descending passage. And you can imagine the excitement in Al Mamun's men. Well, first the disappointment in realizing that the actual entrance was so close to where they were. They must have been kicking themselves. But then, very excited to be in the pyramid, taking a look around the subterranean chamber. Not very impressive. But then, they came back up here, and they noticed that there was sort of something was chipped away, and they could see some granite was revealed. Most of the pyramid is built with limestone, but these were granite plugs. And they thought to themselves, well, maybe there's a passage that goes up from these granite plugs. The problem is the granite is much too hard. Granite is one of the hardest stones on earth. They had nothing that could possibly cut granite. So what would they do? What would Al Mamun do to get around those granite plugs? Well, probably what anybody would do. They'd tunnel through the softer limestone around the granite plugs, and there you go. They made it to the ascending passage. And again, you can imagine the excitement of Al Mamun's men getting around the granite plugs. They might safely assume they were the first people to enter the upper parts of the pyramid since the time of its construction, or since the time it was closed. You can imagine the excitement as they probably thought they were going to find enormous amounts of treasure. Because that's what his men wanted. They wanted treasure. Al Mamun himself wanted sort of secret knowledge and things that they said were in the pyramid. That's what he was interested in. But his men wanted treasure. That's an interesting intersection right there. More on that a little bit later. We'll skip over the star shafts. I'm sorry. Here we have the Grand Gallery, which is astounding. The Grand Gallery, an engineering masterpiece that is 28 feet high and 157 feet long. And then one has to wonder, why is the ascending passage to that point less than 4 feet high? And I really have to make this point very clearly. Okay, you can look from here up to the so-called King's Chamber. Okay, is an ascending passage. Now tell me, why? If this is a tomb, why is the passage halfway up is 4 feet high, and you can't even stand in it? You have to crawl through this. And then the second half of the passage is 28 feet high. Much, much higher than you could ever possibly need a passage to be. That's the height of 4 men standing on top of each other. What in the world can make any sense about this being simply a passage to take the treasure in the king's body up to the king's chamber? How could we make any sense of that sort of design? The slope of the gallery is 26 degrees, exactly half the slope of the exterior of the pyramid, and is smoothly polished, making it very difficult to climb. There were no steps in the ascending passage of the Grand Gallery. Smoothly polished limestone. It was difficult to climb because the angle was too steep. Again, tell me, if you're just going to try to practically transport treasure in a body up to a king's chamber, you would include steps. You would make it easy for yourself to do that. Why make it as hard as possible for yourself? Engineering such a massive chamber diagonally through the masonry of the pyramid is a feat of extraordinary difficulty. What was the purpose of making it so large? That's the Grand Gallery as we see it today, and of course, steps have been put in for tourists who can go throughout the pyramid. But you can imagine a time before there were any steps. That's an older photograph of the Grand Gallery before steps were included, and you can see that man having a bit of difficulty climbing up there. It's very difficult to do without steps. Al Mamun's men entered the king's chamber to find it absolutely empty, except for a large granite box. Given the granite plugs at the entrance of the ascending passage, Al Mamun and his men were convinced that they were the first people to enter the king's chamber since ancient times, but there was nobody There was no treasure, there was nothing, no writing on the walls, no debris of any kind, absolutely nothing, much as we see it today. Obviously, Al-Mamun's men were extremely disappointed, and what Al-Mamun did was later he planted some treasure, basically just some money somewhere in the pyramid for them to find, basically just enough wages to cover with the work they had done, and so they didn't go home empty-handed. Mystery of the granite box. The large granite box, often called a sarcophagus, is carved out of a solid piece of granite, a feat of extraordinary difficulty if you can try to imagine that. Remember, granite being one of the hardest stones on earth. For us today, it is still extremely difficult to do. Egyptologists say the builders of the pyramid used copper chisels to cut granite. That is physically impossible, like trying to cut wood with butter. You can't cut granite with copper anything. Can't be done. Today, granite is cut using powerful diamond saws. If you want to cut a flat piece of granite, you'd use a diamond saw like that. If you want to do something more difficult, if you want to hollow out a block of granite, it's much more difficult and requires diamond core drills and several tons of pressure placed on the drill. You need those kind of tools to hollow out a granite box, like what we see in the King's Chamber. How in the world did the Egyptians do it? It is unknown how the builders of the pyramid could have possessed advanced enough technology to hollow out a granite box and make all 5 sides of the box perfectly smooth. For those who think the box is a sarcophagus, they must explain why there is no lid. It would have been too heavy for grave robbers to remove. This is a very key point. Every sarcophagus has a lid. That one has a lid. That has a lid, although it's been pushed over. Fine. That one has a lid. That's an Egyptian sarcophagus that has a lid. Okay, but you have to tell me where the lid is for the supposed sarcophagus in the King's Chamber. You see, a lid of that sort of sarcophagus would weigh several tons. You have to explain to me how a few grave robbers could have removed a lid that weighed several tons, and more importantly, why. They wouldn't have needed it for anything. If they wanted granite, they could find it in a number of other places, much easier to get. They wouldn't have had to remove a granite sarcophagus lid from the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. Where is the lid? If you can't tell me where the lid is, I don't think we can say that is a sarcophagus. The King's Chamber disturbance. And I think we're going to skip over this, interesting as it is. Okay. Even more baffling than the granite box or the King's Chamber disturbance are the granite beams above the King's Chamber that form 5 mini chambers that were never intended to be seen. Nathaniel Davidson discovered the first chamber, which is now named for him. That's Davidson's chamber. Again, as we can see, you've got these 5, there are 5 actual chambers above the so-called King's Chamber. And they're large enough that people can go inside them. Now, we're going to skip a little bit over this, if you can bear with me. Okay, back to the sort of granite blocks, mystery of the granite blocks. The 5 mini chambers above the King's Chamber contain 43 granite blocks, each weighing about 60 to 70 tons. The nearest granite quarry is about 700 kilometers away in Aswan. How could the builders have moved even one 70-ton block 700 kilometers and then placed it at a height of about 200 feet? Even now, it would be extremely difficult and would require one of these. Okay, the maximum lifting capacity of this crane is 70 tons. The maximum lifting capacity, that's the weight of the blocks we're talking about here that form the passages above the king's chamber. Okay, we can see, possibly doing it with equipment like that, how in the world the Egyptians were said not even to have pulleys or wheels. How could they possibly have done it? Yeah. Well, you've probably heard before something like, well, it's just manpower. You just have enough guys and you can move, okay, you can move a 70-ton block, sure. That theory works okay for the 2.5-ton blocks that Egyptologists like to talk about, because most of the blocks in the Great Pyramid weigh in the neighborhood of about 2.5 tons. We could possibly imagine a group of, say, 20 guys or so moving a 2.5-ton block. What we can't imagine is them moving a 70-ton block. How many men would it take to move a 70-ton block on a flat surface? About 1,000, give or take, to move a... That's a flat surface. Remember that if you're going to transport these blocks up 200 feet up the pyramid, you need a ramp of some sort. So what we have to try to imagine is, them pushing these 70-ton blocks up an inclined ramp. This is where we come into some serious difficulty, because let's say it takes 1,000 men to pull a 70-ton block on a flat surface. It'll take more men than that to push it up a ramp, and you cannot use any lubrication, because obviously if you do, it'll slide back down. Okay? It's very hard to imagine a ramp that would be strong enough to support the weight of the block and, I don't know, more than 1,000 men, okay, and not collapse. How can you make a ramp strong enough? And clearly this is a very flawed ramp theory right here, because the ramp keeps getting steeper and steeper and steeper, and eventually the ramp will be as massive as the pyramid itself. That doesn't work. The same with this one, the old go around the pyramid. Yeah, how do you get the 70-ton block, okay, around the corner with 1,000 men, and how can it be strong enough to support all that weight? Because they tell us that these ramps were built with loose gravel and mud. Now that would not be nearly strong enough to support these kind of weights. The ramp would have to be as strong as the pyramid itself, and as massive. A convincing ramp theory has not yet been suggested. That's the most honest thing I can tell you. There are other people that a very popular theory these days is an internal ramp. The internal ramp theory, that somehow the ramp was constructed inside the pyramid as they built. You come up with the same difficulties with these massive blocks and the massive number of people required to move them. What was the purpose of the 5 mini-chambers above the king's chamber? Because they went to a lot of trouble transporting more than 43 70-ton blocks. It had to be for, you would think, a very good purpose. It's commonly thought that they're relieving chambers meant to diffuse the enormous weight above the masonry above. They're called by most people relieving chambers. Problem is, they're not. Doesn't really make any sense. Look at the diagram. Does anything cause you to doubt the relief chamber idea? Because we can see another chamber farther down in the pyramid where more weight bears upon it. The so-called Queen's Chamber has more weight bearing upon it, but has none of the relieving chambers of the King's Chamber. The Queen's Chamber has done just fine for 4,000 years and has not collapsed. That would tell us very clearly that we don't need relieving chambers for the King's Chamber, the so-called King's Chamber. So what is their purpose? FYI, El-Mamun's men named the King and Queen's Chamber simply because of the ceiling style. These were named by El-Mamun's men. They gave the King's Chamber that name because it had a flat roof. and in their culture, a king's chamber had a flat roof. They gave that chamber the title Queen's Chamber because it had a pointed roof, and in their culture, a queen's chamber had a pointed roof. These names have stuck even till today, but tell me, what evidence is there that this is a king's or a queen's chamber? There really is none. So what is the Queen's Chamber? Well, won't spend a lot of time on this, but it's pretty enigmatic. We don't really know what that room was for, what this interesting sort of niche feature was for. We really don't know. Back to the tomb robbers. It seems probable that Al-Mamun's men were the first people to enter the ascending passage since the construction of the pyramid, as we recall. You remember outlining how they did that. Then, how could anyone believe the tomb robber theory? Actually, there was another way in. There was another way in. It's called the well shaft, and like many features of the Great Pyramid, its purpose is mysterious. So yes, here, starting from almost the bottom of the descending passage, is what is called the well shaft, going straight up to this interesting intersection of the Grand Gallery, the Queen's Chamber passage, and of course the well shaft there. With a little reasoning, we can still discredit the tomb robber theory. Suppose that tomb robbers were able to find the well shaft near the bottom of the descending passage. Let's say they found an amazing quantity of treasure in the King's Chamber, Grand Gallery, and or the Queen's Chamber. How would they get it all out? The well shaft is only 3 feet wide. Anything wider than 3 feet would not fit down the shaft. Using Tutankhamun's tomb as an example, we can safely assume that there would be many objects in Khufu's tomb wider than 3 feet. Here are just a few items from Tut's tomb that have at least 2 dimensions larger than 3 feet and would not fit down the well shaft. Okay, these are all items that would not fit down the well shaft. In addition to being too large, these items were made of wood and would have been almost worthless to the robbers. They were after the things like, gold and gems and so forth. But if you were the robbers and you wanted to fit large items down a 3-foot hole, what would you do? Well, you might break or saw them. What would you find if many items have been broken or sawed? Find lots of sawdust. You'd find lots of, especially the gold items, they'd be very interested in those. You'd find lots of gold dust. You'd find good old-fashioned sawdust from wood. But there was nothing but empty chambers when Al-Mamun's men arrived. No sawdust, no pieces of broken pottery, no ashes from burning torches. Remember, you'd need torches. No mummy, of course. No sarcophagus lid. Very strange. Nothing. You would expect robbers to leave a big mess. And that's exactly what they did in the Valley of the Kings as they pillaged every tomb except Tut's. All the tombs in the Valley of the Kings that we know were tombs, when they were discovered, there was a big mess that the grave robbers had left. All kinds of things they discarded and didn't want. Broken this, broken that. I don't know, chicken bones because they were eating chicken. I mean, there was just a lot of evidence to show that they'd been there, taken the valuables, and left. We saw none of this sort of thing in the Great Pyramid. I believe we're left with no reasonable explanation of how robbers could have removed absolutely everything from the pyramid, including a sarcophagus lid that weighed several tons, could not fit down the well shaft, and had no value to them. If they wanted granite, the nearby pyramid of Menkaure is made of granite, the first 16 courses. The inventory stela. In 1857, a French archaeologist named Auguste Mariette discovered a stela, now called the inventory stela, stating that the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx were already in existence long before Khufu took the throne. That's the inventory stela there, and it's a hard image to find. The inscription also referred to Isis as the mistress of the pyramid. In other words, the monument was older than anyone thought and was dedicated to Isis, not Khufu. But Egyptologists have tried to suppress the inventory stela because it contradicts their theory. It sits in obscurity in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. We're going to skip over the dating of the Sphinx, but just really quickly, it's thought now to be much older than Egyptologists say because of clear patterns of water erosion that we see in the complex. And it was impossible to have those sorts of, that kind of water erosion within the time period that they say that it was built. If Schock is right about the Sphinx, is it possible the Great Pyramid could be much older as well? The inventory stela, radiocarbon dating, and certain legends say that it is much older than Egyptologists claim. If the Great Pyramid is not a tomb, then what is it? No non-tomb theory can be taken seriously until a better suggestion can be made for its actual purpose. There are many alternative theories, but it seems that the Great Pyramid was built at least partly as a temple of knowledge. It has served as a time capsule to preserve the knowledge of mathematics, engineering, architecture, astronomy, science, and philosophy in a language that transcends time, through the darkest periods of human ignorance until a time when humanity had advanced enough to understand the greatness of the monument that had inspired the most brilliant minds through the millennia. Why preserve knowledge on scrolls and tablets that can be destroyed? Why not preserve your knowledge in a monument that cannot be destroyed? Man fears time, but time fears the pyramids. The builders of the Great Pyramid have a message for us all. They are whispering over the ages that there is still so much that we do not know about our past, that the whole story has not yet been told. That they too possessed advanced technology and intellect. They challenge us, even dare us, to create something that will still be here in 5,000 years. We who are so proud of our current level of civilization should sit humbly before the Great Pyramid and learn. That the Great Pyramid is a temple of knowledge is certainly not its only function. But there were legends passed on for centuries that spoke of the pyramid containing a vast knowledge. Indeed, that is what motivated Al-Mamun to launch his expedition. In the end, perhaps people see in the Great Pyramid what they want to see. We may never know the complete purpose of that magnificent monument. But that will not keep us from trying. In 1799, Napoleon visited the Great Pyramid with a guide named Imam Muhammad. At some point, Napoleon asked to be left alone in the king's chamber. Coming out, the general is said to have been very pale and impressed. When an aide asked him in a jocular tone if he had witnessed anything mysterious, Bonaparte replied abruptly that he had no comment, adding in a gentler voice that he never wanted the incident mentioned again. Many years later, when he was emperor, Napoleon continued to refuse to speak of this strange occurrence in the pyramid. At St. Helena, just before the end, that's just before he died, he seems to have been on the point of confiding to Las Casas, but instead shook his head saying, in other words, he was going to tell him what happened, but instead shook his head saying, "No, what's the use? You'd never believe me. I don't think Napoleon was the sort of person who would exaggerate and make crazy stories. Thank you.